Follow us on social media and please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on any updates from our ALS experts.
A fine day, everybody. Your neighborhood is local, and these are all your friends around here. They all have something in common with you, and they have something that they want to share with you. So tonight, come up with some questions, come up with some suggestions, and know that we're all ready and eager to hear about them. And Lisa, it's over to you.
Thanks, McFinn. Welcome, everyone. I am Lisa Deegan, and I want to thank you for joining us all tonight for our ALS talk with Dr. Alison Bateman-House from NYU Grossman School of Medicine and Working Group on Compassionate Use and Pre-Approval Access. She's going to talk about expanded access for rare disease, a topic that she's a renowned expert on. After her talk, please join us for Q&A, and then we will do our non-recorded open forum portion to meet and talk with others within our community. Before we get started, everything ALS team, as you all know, have been affected by ALS, and I'm here because I lost my younger brother, and two of our team members have ALS. So we want to provide you guys with what we didn't have while going through our journey with our loved ones. So please join us in the fight. We need participants for our speech study, and we want to reach 1,000 participants. So together we feel our movement can really help accelerate treatments and end ALS, and we can do it together. So we'll put it in the chat, but you can sign up for our study at everythingals.org/research. And just to give you a quick update to date, we have 780 participants. And so we're at the home stretch. It's the largest voice study in ALS ever. We've collected over 1,000 hours of data. So the experts are collaborating and analyzing it. And we actually share the data directly with you, so you can take it to your doctors and share it with them. And we have a participant portal that tracks all this, where we're banking the data. And we also have some future studies we're working on with sensors and monitors that are going to collect data and provide remote care monitoring. So we're super excited about that. And the goal really of our speech study is to digitize the ALS FRS scores to accelerate therapies so we can better measure in the clinical trials. So check out our podcast, Stories and Innovation in ALS, on Spotify and our YouTube channel. And now for tonight's guest speaker this evening. Dr. Alison Bateman-House is an assistant professor in the Division of Medical Ethics at NYU Grossman School of Medicine and a professor of practice in law at University of Arizona, James E. Rogers College of Law. She is a co-chair of the Working Group on Compassionate Use and Pre-Approval Access, an academic group that studies ethical issues concerning access to investigational medical products. Dr. Bateman-House also co-chairs the Pediatric Gene Therapy and Medical Ethics Working Group. She advises several biopharmaceutical companies, patient advocacy organizations, government and non-governmental entities about clinical trial design and non-trial access programs. She serves as an ethicist for multiple data safety monitoring boards overseeing clinical trials. Dr. Bateman-House also serves as the non-voting chair on the NYU Janssen Pharmaceutical Compassionate Use Advisory Committee for Infectious Disease and Neurology Psychology. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Alison Bateman-House.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, everyone. And I know that we're all in different time zones. It's 7 p.m. here in New York City, and I just finished teaching. So as you already saw, my brain is a little fried. And I thought because of that, maybe I would not do a ton of slides. I would do a few slides, and then I'm really open for a very informal Q&A with you. There is nothing you cannot ask me. I may not be able to answer everything, but I'll try my hardest. And if I don't know it in real time, maybe Lisa or someone on the back end could take it down for me, and I will promise to follow up with you with an answer afterwards. So you just heard who I am, and while I'm still introducing myself, I want to pull up my disclosures just so you can see the relevant companies and groups that I do work with. When I say work with, I don't accept money from these organizations. This is all pro bono, unless it's a travel expense or a specific honorarium for a talk or something. But when I work with Amalex or I am ALS or something, that's not in a paid capacity. And obviously, I'm not speaking on their behalf. I'm speaking on my behalf. And when Lisa was kind enough to invite me to join you today, she recommended that I tell you a little bit about how I got into the world of expanded access. So I've been teaching all day. I feel like I need to be like, okay, someone unmute and tell me who this is. If anyone knows who this is, I would love to hear from you. And I also, let me just say, I have not put the chat up because I am at that point of the day where I can't multitask talking to you and looking at the chat at the same time. So normally I would be able to do that. Feel free to put stuff in the chat and I'll look at it later, but I can't look at it right now. So this is a young woman, unfortunately deceased far too early, named Abigail Burroughs. She was a student at University of Virginia. Some of you might recognize that iconic architecture. And University of Virginia is where I did my undergraduate degrees. I'm originally from Virginia, and a master's degree in bioethics. And when Abigail Burroughs was fighting for her life, she passed away as a college student of cancer. It was big news in the UVA community, and I was there at the time finishing my master's program. So this was something that we were talking about. It was in the local newspapers, and it was my first real exposure to expanded access. And this went on to become a huge case, not solely for her and her family and for the community that, you know, sort of banded together to support her, but this case resulted in a lawsuit, and this lawsuit, which went all the way up to the Supreme Court, which decided not to hear it, is the case law that says there is no constitutional right to an investigational medical product. Investigational medical products, whether they are drugs, vaccines, devices, whatever they are, they belong to the entity that is developing them. So regardless of whether you hear a phrase like right to try or something like that, there is no right. The only thing you can do is ask for it. So this became a huge case. It was something that stayed in the academic press as people wrote articles about it and thought about its implications and what have you. I stayed in academia. I went on and did several other degrees, took some time off, worked in medicine, lived in the Ivory Coast working as a nurse midwife, did many other things, came back, finished a PhD degree at Columbia University here in New York City, and was hired by NYU. And at the same time that I was hired at NYU, compassionate use was back in the news again. Some of you may remember this case of a little boy named Josh Hardy, who again had cancer. In this case, he was not dying of his cancer. He was dying of an infection that he received due to his depleted immune system. And his family was begging for access to a broad spectrum antiviral in hopes that it would save their son's life. Now, I simply point this out because this is so bizarre to me. If you look at this change.org petition, you will see that it was written by someone in Mechanicsville, Virginia. That is my hometown, and it's literally like 10,000 people. So I don't know how this tied into me yet again. First, Abigail Burroughs at my college, and now Regina Breedlove from my hometown, but it is what it is. And maybe that was a divine sign, because I have since devoted my entire career to talking about expanded access. So as I mentioned, I work with pharmaceutical companies to try to help them think through policies. I work with patient advocacy groups to do educational information sessions like this to try to help them think through policies. I work with policymakers on a state and federal level, and actually international level, WHO and others, trying to think through reasonable policies. And what I did is I created this thing called CUPA, Compassionate Use and Pre-Approval Access Working Group, which Lisa mentioned. I'm only mentioning it for you to say that if you go on our website, which you can find by searching NYU CUPA, there are resources there. There are frequently asked questions. There's a list of members. There are things that might interest you. There's a monthly mailing list. We don't sell anything. It's all free information, but it's information about, here's a relevant article that was published, or here's an upcoming talk, or here's an FDA information session, et cetera. So if anyone's interested, feel free to get on that list. You can get off at any time just by emailing and saying, take me off. CUPA, every spring, we do a free expanded access 101 webinar. So if you want more information about expanded access after tonight, feel free to join that. I don't know the date yet, but it'll be announced at some point. And every other year we host a day-long conference, which we just did last week, which I think is part of the reason why my brain is not fully functional at the moment. And finally, last but not least, every summer, I co-teach a 5-week intensive graduate level course on access to investigational drugs. We talk about clinical trials, expanded access, right to try, the whole Megillah. And we offer several scholarships for patient advocates to be able to take that course for free. And I am proud to say that 2 of the people who have had scholarships in the past are from the ALS community. So that's me telling you what I have to offer you. And now let's just talk about what expanded access is. Oh, I'm sorry. And I should mention who is in this group. So I mentioned it was a multi-stakeholder group. Academics like me, people who actually run trials, design trials, participate in trials, medical personnel, lawyers, patient advocates, patients themselves, family members, people in industry, both in large and small companies, which that's relevant for expanded access in terms of large and small companies have different capabilities to be able to offer expanded access. Current and former members of the FDA, people who participate in institutional review boards or other sort of hospital administrative roles that are involved in expanded access, even journalists, because it's important to know how people are communicating facts about this publicly. And it's an international group. So I not only speak to people like you here in the United States, we try to help people internationally understand what's happening with expanded access. And we have a 3-part mission, which is to do the research to find out what is happening, to weigh in on policy considerations where we think it is needed, and then, as I said, educational offerings like tonight. So enough about that. Let's talk about expanded access. And like I said, I'm doing a very minimal amount of slides and want to open for just free form Q&A. I'm happy to talk about anything. And again, I saw some people on the call are super expert. So I hope they will forgive me if I take this down to just the bare bones at the moment to make sure we're all on the same page. I apologize for anyone who is like, I know this, get on to the more, high level stuff, but let's just start slow and move forward. And like I said, I'm happy to open for Q&A and go wherever y'all want to go. So when you go to the pharmacy or when you're treated at your doctor's office, you are being treated most of the time with FDA approved products. That is just sort of the gatekeeper for a product to be able to be used and prescribed in the United States. And obviously, when it comes to something like ALS, where there's just not a lot of effective FDA approved products, that's not sufficient for people. So that's when people might start looking at clinical trials. And clinical trials are the main route of access to unapproved products. So when I talk about pre-approval access, the majority of that pre-approval access happens in the clinical trial realm. And there's a little schematic here just showing clinical trials take time, they take people, and it's the idea of, you start small, exposing a small number of people to a compound of unknown toxicity, unknown dosage, unknown safety, unknown efficacy. And as you learn more about it, you start exposing more people. The thing to keep in mind when it comes to clinical trials is there's no guarantee that you yourself are going to benefit from participating in a trial. In fact, in certain areas, such as neurology, you're actually more likely not to benefit from being in a trial. You're more likely to have a serious adverse event than to actually get a benefit from the trial. But what you're doing is you're contributing to a stockpile of knowledge that's going to hopefully help your community. You may be helped personally, but hopefully we will learn for the benefit of the community as a whole. And as this process is happening, the other important thing to remember is most of the compounds that go into clinical trials end up not being brought to market. There is a dramatic failure rate. So things that look really, really good early on, they look good in animals, they look good in cell cultures, they even look good in early numbers of patients, they end up not making it to market. because of either the efficacy is not there once you start getting it in more people, or they are too toxic. It's not considered safe enough to expose people to. And the last thing that I want to say is there is obviously a difference between what is deemed marketable and what helps an individual person. And that's something that we'll have to come back to when we talk about expanded access. But just keep in mind, trials are done to bring products to market. You're looking for something that has a populational benefit. And so you can have a failed trial, a quote unquote failed trial, in which some people benefited. These are called atypical responders. And it's always very frustrating to people to say, you know, but some people benefited or some people seem to improve. And why is this being considered a failed trial? And that's because people aren't looking at individual outcomes in trials. They're looking at sort of the populational dynamics, with the idea of being able to extrapolate from the population that's in that trial to the actual large patient population. I'm going to stop talking about that, but again, I'm happy to come back to it to the extent anyone wants to talk about it. But what I want to talk about is I want to say, particularly in things like ALS, there are a lot of people who can't participate in clinical trials. They may very much want to, they may try to, but they can't. It could be because the trial is too far away from them and they don't have the time or the socioeconomic capability, or a caretaker who can take off from work or what have you to get back and forth to the trial site. There may be restrictive inclusion criteria, and a person's condition is too advanced, or they were diagnosed too long ago, or something that has taken them outside of the criteria of that trial. These are the people for whom we're talking about expanded access. So it's non-trial, this is not in a trial, and it's pre-approval because this is an unapproved product. This is access that is intended to permit access to these otherwise unavailable, unapproved products in hopes that they're going to be personally beneficial to patients who have no approved or research options. So it's not that you can just say, I don't like Radicava, I think is one of the ALS drugs, if I'm saying it correctly, and I don't want to try it, and I want to try something through expanded access. Or, I see this trial's open and I'm eligible for it, but I don't want to do it. I want to try something. Expanded access is intended to be the exception to the rule being that you need to either use approved drugs or participate in clinical trials. This is a compassionately intended exceptional situation, which it says if you are seriously or life-threateningly ill, you have no approved or research options, your physician and other people have made the determination that the investigational product has more potential benefit than risk for you, and that providing access to you outside of a trial is not going to harm that trial. It's not going to slow the trial so it doesn't complete. In those cases, you would be eligible for expanded access. And it could be just a one person, what we call a single patient expanded access, where it's just you, your doctor, a drug company, the FDA, and it happens, or it can be a program. And these programs are normally run either by pharmaceutical companies that are setting up a program for their drug. I think there's one right now with Neuron. So that's an expanded access program that is run by the drug sponsor, or they can be run by institutions. And we know the Healy Center has an expanded access program run out of it. The other option for non-trial pre-approval access is right to try, which I'm sure you've heard a lot about over the years. I'm not going to talk a lot about right to try unless you decide to bring that up in the Q&A. It is not a very effective pathway. It is not used by many people. It is not used by many companies. And I don't think it's something that we should spend a lot of time talking about. So I'm happy to answer questions, but most of the activity in the non-trial pre-approval space is in expanded access. So just to recap again, the objective of this is treatment. We're trying to help the individual in the expanded access program. There's no guarantee, however. And even though this is treatment and we're trying to help that person, there may be data collection. And when you hear data collection, you think, oh, a clinical trial. Well, the objective of the clinical trial is data collection to have these generalized learnings. The objective of expanded access is trying to help that patient, and there may be data collected on the side. So it's just a sort of a question of what is the foci of what you're doing. They can look very similar. You can have a trial that looks very similar to an expanded access program, et cetera. The question is, what is this sort of central motivating element? And the thing I want to note about data collection from expanded access is it can be incredibly useful. It has been used by FDA, European Medical Association, payers, et cetera. But that is atypical. It is more frequently than not considered sort of nice, but not actionable. So I've heard some people say things like, we should, not worry about doing clinical trials. We should just run expanded access programs and we can collect real world data from that. And that's how we develop new drugs. And at this point in time, that's just not a feasible possibility. And I'm happy to talk about that more if you want. I also just want to note, data collection, of course, places burdens on patients. They might have to take more labs or do more, activities than they otherwise would be asked to do. And it's very burdensome on clinicians and institutions. So even if there's a situation in which there's some data that might be useful and reasonable to collect, it may be that it's not going to be collected simply because of the burden it's going to place either on the clinicians or the patients or both. If I can remember how to advance my slide. There we go. So with me saying, what expanded access is, that it's intended for patient benefit, I think it's important to understand what we mean by patient benefit. This is, I want to note, this is research that my team did, but it's in oncology, right? And oncology is not ALS. So I don't want to say that what we found here is necessarily, able to be extrapolated to ALS. I'm only putting it here to sort of spur your thoughts. So we asked a number of pediatric hematologists and oncologists who had experience mainly with expanded access. I think one of them had tried Right to Try. Why did you do this? What did you think about the process? What were the learnings that people, should learn from your experience? And one of the big questions we asked is, do you think that this benefited someone? And if so, in what way? And I want to share the data with you. So 33 of our respondents said, yes, there was a benefit. It was a psychological benefit to the family of the patient. It gave the family of the patient hope. 23 of them said it had a psychological benefit to the actual patient, him or herself. 18 said that, yes, there was a benefit. It was in overall survival of the patient. 17 said, yes, there was a benefit to the patient with regard to quality of life. 6 said that there was some other clinical benefit to the patient. That could be something like, decreased symptom burden or something. 3 said something about benefits to the family of the patient that was beyond psychological benefit. I think if I recall correctly, it was more on sort of like the economics of, they were able to get access to treatments without having to pay for them, et cetera. And one person said, yes, there was a benefit, and that was that they and their institution learned from the experience. So when we talk about, there's an anticipated benefit or there's a hope of a benefit from expanded access, I want to keep in mind that that does not necessarily mean a medical benefit or an increase in longevity or, decrease of symptoms, et cetera. That's what we all hope for, but it's not necessarily what is going to happen. And even if those don't happen, sometimes people still get benefits from the experience for some of the reasons mentioned here. So that's just food for thought that I wanted to throw out there. And here's sort of the takeaways that I take away from that. So expanded access is access to, I'm sorry, there's sirens in the background because I am at a hospital. This access to investigational medical products outside of clinical trials, it can lead to medical benefits to patients. This is more likely to happen the further along in that clinical trial development schematic that I showed you. The more we know about the proper dosage, the proper, dosing schedule, the safety profile, et cetera, the more likely that you're going to have an actual medical benefit from that product, as opposed to products that are less well characterized and for which there's more uncertainty. Doesn't mean that you can't have a product that, the first time it's used in humans, it turns out to be, just like a blockbuster drug. That has happened, particularly in cancer. There's a drug called Gleevec. It was used in phase 1 patients and they were cured, but that is very exceptional, which is why we know those stories, because they're the sort of thing that, give you such excitement. It's not normal. Expanded access can lead to psychological benefits for both patients and families, as I mentioned earlier. It can result in data collection, but again, this is data collection that is not clinical trial caliber, and it's probably not going to be viewed as all that actionable by particularly regulators like the FDA. And then on sort of like the negative side of things, expanded access can result in increased cost on patients. So what do I mean by that? I mean opportunity cost. So you're doing this rather than doing something else. Opportunity cost in terms of you're having to put forth your time and your energy to be involved in the expanded access program. You may have side effects, et cetera. And then there are also actual financial cost. So there is a prohibition on companies. They cannot charge a profit for an unapproved drug. Typically what happens is they make these drugs available for free, but there are all sorts of ancillary costs. So maybe if the drug is being infused, you have to pay an infusion cost, or you have to pay for, a nurse's time, or you have to pay lab fees, parking in the parking garage. All of these things, they add up. And typically they are not covered by insurance, although we can talk about that if you want to delve into it. And these expenses can get significant over time. So that's just something to keep in mind when people are making a decision about, do I want to try expanded access? And to me, there's no right or wrong. I think it's an individual patient's decision as to whether this is something that is right for them to try or not. But the thing that you need to remember is, as much as individual patients may make decisions about this is a good or bad thing for me to pursue, the gatekeeper is the company that is developing that product. I mentioned earlier, there had been a lawsuit that actually said there is no constitutional right to these products. So non-trial pre-approval access, either through expanded access or right to try, is not legally required by companies. They can choose to do it, and they can choose not to do it. And because it is a choice on their part, they are pretty much the sole determinators of what that is going to look like. Are they only going to do it for single patients? Are they going to do it for a program? Are they going to do it only in one country? Are they going to do it globally? How long are they going to do it? For how many people? All of those things are that companies get to decide. And that's why I spend a lot of time talking with companies, because I want them to think through the ramifications for those choices and try to come up with something that's better, that as good as possible for the most number of people. I'm an ethicist, so I just have to talk ethics for a second. We do not believe, I'm sure there are other people out there who would disagree with this, but just as a general rule in our country, we don't say that companies are ethically required to give access to their unapproved medical products to everyone who asks for it. We say that, it might be nice, it might be desirable, there might be reasons why we would encourage companies to do it, but we don't think it's something necessarily has to happen across the board, that companies can pick and choose when they do it and how. But I put here that, as evidence grows that this product is safe and effective, as product grows, that as we're increasingly confident in the fact that yes, enough of this drug can be manufactured so that we're not going to be harming our supply, as evidence grows that, yes, we can provide access outside of trials while not hurting clinical trials. As this sort of information accrues, suddenly it starts looking more and more compelling on the part of a company to say, yeah, you really should be doing this. On the other hand, if as a drug more is learned about it and we go, wow, look, the supply chain is really broken, they're having a hard time getting enough drug, or, wow, the more we learn about it, the worse the safety looks, et cetera, the less sort of pressure there is on a company at that point to provide expanded access. So this is a constantly sort of adjusting situation in which something that looks really compelling for a company to offer expanded access, 1 month, 6 months later or something, we could be like, well, that doesn't look as compelling as it did. And I just put here, sort of like the most compelling case. If someone were to say to me, like, would you ever tell a company like you have a moral obligation to provide access? Yeah, if there's a cheap to manufacture product, cheap to use, that can be used safely for a rapidly progressive serious disease, and we've had a successful phase 3 trial that has really nailed down the safety and efficacy, and it looks like this drug is going to be approved. In that case, I would tell a company, you absolutely have to offer access. You're not doing your clinical trials anymore. We have all the reason to believe that this product works and that it can be made available safely. Do it. And then sort of that's the most compelling case, and various cases sort of trickle down from that. And then I'm almost at the end of my slides, so I hope you're coming up with questions for me. But, so obviously not all companies provide expanded access, but some of them do. And for those who do, they don't always wait until the end of a phase 3 trial. They might offer access, during a phase 2 trial or something. So the question is, why do some companies decide to offer access at all, and especially earlier access? And I really have 3 answers here, which you can see on the screen. The company may be like, we think our product is helpful, we have confidence in it. There's not a lot out there to help people who have these dire diseases. We want to make it available in hopes that it's going to help them. That's a great reason, all in favor of that reason. There's also the idea of, we see this product as being safe and effective enough to be able to get FDA approval. And so what we want to do is start getting word of our drug out to people now. We want institutions to start being familiar with handling it in the pharmacy. We want doctors to be used to using it. We want patient advocacy groups to have heard the name of our drug. This is called market seeding. I'm not necessarily adverse to this. I think it's just a reality, but it's just one of the reasons that you need to keep in mind why a company may decide to offer expanded access. And in this case, they're probably going to do something like an expanded access program, something larger, as opposed to just these single patient one-offs. And then, last but certainly not least, as we mentioned earlier, it's an opportunity to collect data. By definition, these people in the expanded access are people who cannot qualify for the clinical trial. So it's not like you're, comparing apples and apples. These are apples and oranges, but it might be useful, especially in trying to convince insurance companies after a drug is approved to say, okay, well, look, the drug was tested in this very narrow slice of the patient population, but we actually think you should be willing to pay for it for a much wider, array of patients. That's where they would want this sort of expanded access data to say, and look, we tried it in people who weren't in the clinical trials, and you can see what happened. So here, my final takeaways, and then it's Q&A. In the United States, there is a law that when a drug in development is in phase 2 testing, phase 2 testing is when we're starting to look for efficacy, not just safety, but, does it actually work on the condition for which it's being developed? The developing entity, biopharma company, university, whatever it is required to have a publicly available expanded access policy. Now, publicly available, what does that mean? Most places interpret that as meaning put it on your website somewhere, but not everyone does that. Sometimes they're like, well, you have to call us and then we'll send it to you or something. But they're required by law to have a publicly available expanded access policy. Now, this policy could say we don't offer access, or it could say we do offer access, but only after the end of the phase 2 trial, or after the trial is fully enrolled. It could be any number of things depending on what the company chooses, but they have to be able to make public what that policy is. Not all companies are in compliance with this. So if you encounter a company that is not in compliance, I encourage you to name and shame them and get them into compliance, because this particular law has no penalty. So it's not like they get slapped with a fine or they lose access to some desired thing. This is really just something that is enforced by naming and shaming. So I encourage you all to be willing to engage in that if you so desire. Again, as I said, it's the entity developing the drug that gets to decide whether to make it available through expanded access or right to try, or nothing at all outside of the clinical trials. And this decision is really complicated. Like, it's really complicated, or I wouldn't have spent years of my life talking about this issue. But regardless of what a company chooses, yes, expanded access, no expanded access, whatever, they need to be able to justify their decision publicly. And you should have no hesitation asking them to do so. And once they do, obviously you are able to push back and say that doesn't make sense to me, or it doesn't seem right, et cetera. And that's just, part of reality in a world in which there are people with competing interests and whatnot, and we try to negotiate things that work for all of us. And sometimes some people's interests are going to win out, and sometimes other entities' interests are going to win out, but we at least try to have that dialogue, at least explaining where each other is coming from in hopes of getting to something that we can all live with. The last 2 points, when I talk about expanded access requests, particularly for a single patient, that has to be steered by a physician. That's not something that you as a patient or you as a caregiver can do. So you have to find a physician who's willing to do this for you. And not all physicians are, either because they're not a big fan of the drug that you're interested in, or they don't feel that they have time or the experience or the institutional resources, et cetera. So when people contact me and say, look, I want to get expanded access to drug Y, and I don't know where to start, I say, well, you have to find a physician. And I recommend that you look at research hospitals, because research hospitals typically have both clinicians who are more familiar with investigational products and also just infrastructure they are ready to use, as compared to, your local community hospital. Local community hospitals are great, and there's no reason why they can't do expanded access, but they're going to need some hand holding. And it may be you who ends up doing that. And if so, thank you. That's wonderful of you. But if you don't have the bandwidth to take that on, I think you probably want to start with a research hospital. And so last, but certainly not least, there are people out there with expertise that you should feel free to tap. I'm here. I represent CUPA. You're welcome to contact us and see if there's something we can do to help you. I know you're familiar with the Healy Center platform trial and expanded access program. And so obviously they are a reputable source of information. I am ALS's clinical trials group, has done work in this area and are very knowledgeable, and the ALS Association as well. So with that, I'm giving you my email address and my Twitter handle. Feel free to reach out to me directly. And I'm going to stop my sharing and go into Q&A. I don't know if Lisa wants to moderate that or not. And then I also see that there's stuff in the chat that I haven't had a chance to look at yet. So I will start looking at that.
So,
Thanks for listening to my slides. And Lisa, over to you.
Yeah, we're going to moderate it. Sarah on the Everything ALS team will introduce herself and the student ambassador. Let's get to it. We've got 2 minutes, so we want to get all those questions
absolutely
for everyone.
So like I said, my name is Sarah. Everything ALS team member, lost my dad to ALS in 2018. We have about 12 questions from the chat. What can individuals do to push for expanded access, and what do you recommend from a advocacy community?
Well, as I said, the gatekeeper to expanded access is the entity that is developing the product, right? So if you're interested in product X, you got to figure out who's developing product X. And sometimes that's complicated, especially sometimes, multiple companies join together to work on product X. You got to figure out who's in charge of product X. You got to figure out, do they have a publicly available policy on expanded access? What does it say? And does what it say, make sense? It's good. You think it's a good policy or not? And if not, who at that company do you talk to try to get a change or to at least express what it is that needs to, be considered differently. There are people who will say, this is an FDA thing. It's not an FDA thing. This is 100%. You need to start with companies. Companies may say, look, we're worried about what the FDA will think, or we're saying this because, the FDA indicated X, Y, and Z. When things get more complicated than that, then that's when you have to have these, conclaves where you bring entities together and be like, okay, here's the patient advocacy perspective, here's the company perspective, here's FDA, but you really have to start with the company. And then, as I said earlier, frequently companies are not willing to talk to patients. They might be willing to talk to patient advocacy organizations, but they're most comfortable talking with clinicians. So I think the other thing that you would really need to do is figure out who those clinicians are that are knowledgeable about expanded access and are willing to engage in this. And it's time consuming and it's frustrating. And so not every physician is going to say yes, but at the same time, not every patient or caregiver has the bandwidth to do this either. So I hope that was a sufficient answer. And if not, feel free just to circle back and say more.
No, that was great.
Hi, Dr. Bateman-House. I'm James. I'm the other moderator. Moving right along, going back to when you spoke about general rule versus atypical results, is there a rule of thumb number-wise / what is the magic number that would motivate a company to consider cases as general population instead of just atypical?
So every trial before it starts goes through a statistical analysis plan, and they figure out this is how many people we need to have in the trial in order to be able to get a statistically significant result. And these are our sort of backup plans we have in case we can't, get that many people in, or if things start showing up, that are provocative and interesting right off the bat, whether that's, good signs or bad signs, so that they kind of predetermine all this stuff ahead of time. And then as the data starts coming in, typically the researchers don't see that data, or at least not in any sort of sort of veiled format. There are things called data safety monitoring boards, who are the only people who can actually see that data in real life. And then it's really just an ongoing conversation between the data safety monitoring board, the statisticians, the company, and the trial investigators going back and forth and saying, hey, look, it looks like 3 people are really improving. Is that something that statistically is meaningful to us, or do we think that's just random chance? And there is no algorithm here. This is something that, is hotly debated in every single trial. So this is why you can you can have the exact same data and different people can look at it and say, this is a failed trial, this is not a failed trial. Well, maybe overall it's a failed trial, but for some subset of people, it looked promising. This is why there's so much contention about trials. It's because there is no magic rule of thumb. We talk about statistically significant, P of 0.05%. That's meaningless. Like, that is just a convention. So that's why these things are so difficult, because smart people who can make reasoned arguments can look at data and interpret it differently.
No, that's really helpful. When you discussed like the definition of expanded access, you talked about those ineligible for a trial. Does that mean both there are no spots left, or is it only medically ineligible?
It is super comprehensive. So it could be that there are no spots left in the trial. It could be that you don't qualify for the spots that are left. It could be that you do qualify for the spots that are left, but for some pragmatic reason, you cannot participate. So this is what I'm saying again. You qualify for a trial in Boston, but you live in Wyoming. It is not feasible for most people to travel back and forth from Wyoming to Boston, back and forth for a trial. So even though you're eligible for the trial and there's room in the trial, it would not be considered reasonable to expect you to have to participate in that trial. Now, that determination, again, is made by the company. And there are some companies who are much more understanding about the realities of life, and other companies that are much more, you want it, you go to my trial, figure out how to get to Boston. you know, in terms of the rule of thumb, it does not have to be just that you're medically ineligible.
Next question is, personally, where do you see the progress going for expanded access in about the next 5 years?
When I started in this field, expanded access was something that most people outside of oncology didn't know what I was talking about. That is no longer the case. There's obviously a ton of interest in neurology. There's a ton of interest in pediatric rare disease, and especially during COVID, there was a ton of interest in infectious diseases. So I think that this is something that is becoming more commonly understood. And I am hopeful that that means that since it's no longer just a, you know, weird oncology thing, that institutions are going to start devoting resources to it. It is very uncommon for an institution to have research staff devoted to expanded access, or even to have like a policy handbook. It's just been an atypical thing. And I think that that is starting to change. And I think that is well and good, because it's really, really hard to ask an already busy clinician to design something from scratch. But if you can say, look, there's already a playbook here, there's already precedent at your university or a peer university, and all you need to do is follow what's in this playbook, it's suddenly much more feasible. I also think a lot of companies are deciding it's not as scary as they thought it was. There's been I was going to say old wives' tale, but that's pejorative. Urban legend. There's been a legend for years that if you had a safety event in expanded access, that the FDA was going to put your trial on hold and it was going to hurt you in trying to bring that drug to market. FDA has said repeatedly, this is not true. They say, we understand the reason people are not in clinical trials is because typically they're sicker or they have, you know, comorbidities or something. And it's reasonable to expect that there are going to be safety concerns that arise in this population. And we're going to evaluate them one by one and not automatically say, wow, this must be a bad drug. And I think that message is finally getting out to companies. And so companies that reflexively in the past would have said, that's too risky, we can't even think about it, are now saying, we'll think about it.
You discussed kind of and touched on insurance and expanded access. Can you just kind of maybe make an overstatement as to why insurance might not be involved and the basis behind that?
Insurers, whether they are private or public, so public is your Medicaid, your Medicare, your Veterans Administration, your private or, you know, your Aetnas and United Healthcare and stuff like that, as a general rule, do not pay for unapproved medicines. They do, by and large, pay for clinical trial related expenses, but expanded access is not a clinical trial. So you're dealing with a product that they do not pay for, not in a trial setting, which would mean that they were paying for it. So they're not going to pay for it. It would be very, very, very uncommon for an insurer to pick up these costs. They do occasionally pick up some of the ancillary cost. So like if you have to have blood work to monitor you while you're on the drug or something, and it's blood work that you would be getting anyway, it's like routine monitoring or something, they'll pay for that because it's considered just your standard care. And yeah, it's also being used as part of a, you know, expanded access scenario, but they're willing to pay for it. But if you, for the expanded access, you have to have, say, for example, an MRI that you otherwise would not have, they're not going to pay for that. Okay. So that's why you end up seeing people, particularly on crowdfunding sites, trying to find money to participate in expanded access. It's not that the drug costs money. In most cases, the company provides the drug for free, occasionally at cost, but that is very, very, very uncommon. Normally they provide the drug for free, but then there are these extra costs that go along with it. And often insurance will not pay for those.
Thank you.
We have a fair amount of individuals who tune in and watch this who are not in the US. And so this question is, for those individuals who don't reside in the United States, are they also included in expanded access as well?
Absolutely. The majority of expanded access is for people outside of the United States, because what happens is you have a product that is approved in the United States, which means that the FDA thinks it's safe and effective for an indication, but it is not going to get to that other country for months to years, either because it needs to be approved by your home regulator, or once it's approved by your home regulator, you have to have your health technology assessor, evaluate it, the cost benefit. Do we want to pay for this? How much are we going to pay, et cetera? I think on average, the last numbers I saw was it's like an 18-month lag between approval in the United States and approval in most of Europe. And then there's also that reimbursement negotiation. During that period of sort of a limbo is when most expanded access happens. So yeah, you should definitely feel free to look into expanded access if you're outside of the United States. Unfortunately, most of the information is targeted towards an American audience, and almost all of those policies that I mentioned that have to be publicly available are only in English. So this is a huge impediment to people who are not English literate enough to be able to handle, sort of a legalese type form. At this conference that we run that I mentioned we just had last week, we had speakers. We had a mother in France who was getting expanded access for her child through a US drug company, and a man in South Korea who sought expanded access for his wife and ended up having to move her to the United Kingdom in order to get access. But, so it's more difficult for people outside of the United States, but it can certainly happen.
So just to give a check at where we're at, we have about 10 minutes left and 7 questions. So let's try and get as many in there as we can. So
speed round. Okay, let's do it.
Okay. Is there a liability issue with EAP if somebody is participating in it?
In theory, it could be. In reality, 3 different studies have been done of the medical literature, and no one has ever found a lawsuit. Basically, there is an understanding that when you take on the risk of an unapproved drug, bad things could happen, and you're just sort of waiving your ability to sue. I do not find that a factor that is very influential in companies deciding whether or not to offer access.
Can you discuss how manufacturing limitations also impact a drug's sponsor's ability to supply a therapy for expanded access?
Yeah, I mean, supply is huge, right? And especially when you get to complicated drugs. It's one thing to have a chemical compound that, as long as you have enough raw material and have a robot that can slap things together, you can create drug ad nauseum pretty cheap. But as soon as you start getting into biologics or something where you're taking cells from a person and then manipulating and then putting them back in, those things are very expensive. They're very complicated. They're time consuming, and they require deeply specialized expertise and facilities that are in limited capacity. So as soon as you start getting into those complicated things, it is increasingly unlikely you're going to get expanded access simply because of supply issues and the sort of cost issues that go along with creating that supply.
Are people able to pay for expanded access out of pocket?
So I can only talk about this from the United States, right? I'm American, and this is what I know best. I mean, I don't know what you mean by pay for it out of pocket. So the drug is normally provided free.
Right.
And so there's no payment there. And then those sort of related costs that I've mentioned of monitoring and doctor's visits and stuff, you will have to pay out of pocket for that because your insurer is likely not going to pay for it.
Okay, so if a company decides not to do an expanded access program for financial reasons, being running the program and everything else, you could not cover those costs yourself?
No, not really. I mean, what could happen is an organization like a patient advocacy organization could come and say, we are going to give you a philanthropic loan to help you establish this program. But as an individual, no, you can't do this as an individual.
I'm going to skip around here because I feel like this is a very popular question. Can your primary care physician be the doctor to request expanded access for you?
Sure, but your primary care physician probably knows little to nothing about expanded access. So it's really the specialists who know this. Any clinician can be your specialist. Can be your sort of navigator through this process, but it is going to be easier on them if they have access to an IRB, a legal counsel, other entities that understand what is involved, and that's really going to be your specialty folks who have access to that.
So this next one will be our last question. Actually, we made it through. I double counted, so I apologize for saying 7. Our last question is if companies are not publicly posting that they are going to have an EAP program, whether that's on their website or through phone inquiries, is there a way to find out that information through some sort of central database?
No, it's not that there are no databases, it's that there is no requirement that people post to the databases. So in theory, you should be able to find this information on clinicaltrials.gov, but there is no requirement for it to be there. There is something called the Expanded Access Navigator created by something called the Reagan-Udall Foundation for the FDA. It is there. It is a one-stop shop in theory, but companies are not required to post information there. So you'll find spotty compliance. And then, as I said, many companies have interpreted that mandate of having a publicly accessible policy to mean that it's on their website somewhere, but there's no consistency on where in their website it is. We actually, every year, our interns, when we bring in interns, one of the first things we ask them to do is to try to track down policies at various company websites just to see how difficult it is, and also to see if there's been any change in the previous year, and it really has never gotten better. So some companies will have them under patients, other companies will have them under pipeline, other companies will have them under clinical trials, which makes no sense because it's not a clinical trial. There is no one-stop shop, unfortunately. And then the worst part is if it's not publicly accessible and you do have to start reaching out to the company, there's again no uniformity in who you should be talking to. Is it the patient advocacy liaison? Is it the head of the development program for that drug? Is it the chief medical officer? Is it the CEO? It varies from company to company. So that's another frustration.
Okay, so maybe I misspoke one more time. We had one more question added to the chat that I think is actually very important. And so I'm going to quickly ask this one too. Do physicians, in order to do the clinical trial or the expanded access program, have to have participated in the trial?
Nope, not at all.
Okay. And in terms of how you could go about navigating that situation, if somebody says, I didn't participate in the clinical trial, is there any kind of evidence or way to back that up that is not required?
Send them to talk to me. I'll tell them.
Perfect.
No, there's zero requirement that they participate in the trial. All they have to do is they have to fill out the paperwork. There is a one-page form on the FDA website. They need to fill out that one-page form. They need to send it to the FDA. They'll have to do something like, what's their medical license number, et cetera, et cetera. The other part is they need to be able to show some credentials to the drug company so the drug company has faith in them. So I was involved in a case once where a dentist requested access and the drug company said, no, we're not trusting our product to a dentist, go find somebody else. So the drug company has the right to say no, but typically as long as you can show that you're a licensed practicing physician, that's all that they care about. If you're talking about one of these complicated drugs that has to be, like sub-zero temperatures and special handling facilities, et cetera, they may have some sticky requirements about, we need to see what your pharmacy can do, because there's no point sending you drug to have the pharmacy destroy it. But that's not at all the same thing as like the physician needs to participate in the clinical trial. Now, actually, let me preface that by saying, again, companies get to make their own policies. So a company could say, we're only working with doctors who are participating in our clinical trial, but that's a company decision. That's not a legal thing. There is no legal requirement that the physician be part of the trial.
Okay. All right. Well, on that note, it is officially 8 o'clock. So, 8 o'clock my time and yours. We will say thank you for your time. We enjoyed this very much. Definitely answered a lot of our questions, and hope you have a great rest of your evening, and maybe we'll get to see you soon.